Tense scenes in the Oval Office between US President Donald Trump and his guest, South Africa's leader Cyril Ramaphosa. Well, Mr. Trump says Mr. Ramaphosa's government has been carrying out what he has described as genocide against South Africa's white farmers. Well, our correspondent in South Africa, Pumza Filani, went to the area which Mr. Trump says was proof of this genocide, and she fact-checked it.
Kill the white farmer and take their land.
A diplomatic meeting turned ambush. America's Donald Trump makes incendiary comments about what it's like to be a white farmer in South Africa.
These are all people that recently got killed.
His counterpart, President Cyril Ramaphosa, uncomfortable but composed, sits through the so-called evidence of the claims.
These are burial sites, right?
The room in Washington was dressed in flags and confidence. Marble columns, polished wood, microphones aligned like obedient soldiers. Cameras hummed softly as the spokesperson stepped forward, voice steady, rehearsed, compassionate. The words came carefully packaged, designed for headlines and evening news cheerings. A new initiative, they said, a humanitarian concern, a moral obligation, a plan to protect vulnerable white farmers in South Africa from persecution and violence. For a brief moment, the room held its breath. Then the cameras leaned in. Across the Atlantic, in Johannesburg, the same words landed very differently. They arrived not as concern, but as an echo, an old echo, one Africa had heard before, wrapped in sympathy, delivered in moral language, but carrying the familiar weight of power, control, and selective memory. The announcement was framed as benevolence. Washington's language was soft, almost tender. Protection, safety, human rights, refuge, aid. The press releases were immaculate, polished by consultants who knew exactly which historical nerves to touch. Images followed quickly. Somber music, slow-motion shots of farms at dusk, interviews clipped to fit a single narrative. A story of endangered innocence, under siege, needing rescue. In the United States, it worked. Talk shows erupted. Commentators spoke of forgotten victims. Social media amplified outrage. Old fears were dusted off and rebranded as modern concern. A simple story took hold. Civilized order threatened by chaos. Farmers targeted by a hostile state. America stepping in because no one else would. What was not said carried more weight than what was. No one spoke of land taken by force, measured with chains and rifles. No one mentioned laws that once decided who could own soil and who could only work it. No one explained why certain farms existed where villages once stood, or why memory itself was treated as an inconvenience. The plan had a name, crafted to sound neutral, almost bureaucratic. But behind closed doors, it was understood as leverage, a pressure point, a way to remind South Africa, and Africa as a whole, that sovereignty was still conditional in the eyes of old powers. In Pretoria, silence followed the announcement. Not confusion, not shock, silence. Because silence, in this context, was calculation. South Africa had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that reacting too quickly fed the machine. The media cycle thrived on outrage, not reflection. And this plan, this so-called act of protection, was not new. It was recycled history with modern branding. The land question had never been resolved. It had only been postponed. Apartheid had fallen, but the map it left behind remained largely intact. Ownership lines drawn in another century still dictated wealth in this one. Generations had passed, but the soil remembered. It always did. In rural provinces, elders listened to the news on crackling radios. They did not need analysts to explain the deeper meaning. They had lived it. Their grandparents had been moved at gunpoint. Their parents had worked land they could never own. Promises of reform had been slow, cautious, negotiated endlessly to avoid upsetting foreign investors and international markets. And now, suddenly, the world cared deeply about land again. But only one side of the story. In Cape Town, journalists gathered outside Parliament, waiting. The city buzzed with tension. The question on everyone's lips was not whether South Africa would respond, but how. Inside, the debate was fierce but focused. This was not just about a policy. It was about narrative control. For decades, Africa had been spoken about, analyzed, rescued, warned, sanctioned, and instructed. Rarely had it been listened to. The White Farmer Plan was simply the latest chapter in a long book written elsewhere. What Washington had underestimated was fatigue. Africa was tired of explaining itself. The backlash did not begin with speeches. It began with coordination. Quiet phone calls between capitals. Pretoria to Abuja. Pretoria to Addis Ababa. Pretoria to Brasilia and New Delhi and Beijing. Not alliances born overnight, but relationships matured through shared experience of being on the receiving end of moral lectures backed by economic threat. When South Africa finally spoke, it did not shout. The foreign minister stood before the cameras, posture calm, voice controlled. No anger, no defensiveness, just clarity. South Africa rejected the premise entirely. There was no genocide, no targeted campaign, no humanitarian crisis that justified external intervention. Violence existed, yes, as it did in many societies, but it was not racial policy. It was crime, inequality, and the unfinished business of history. Problems to be addressed internally, not weaponized externally. Then came the sentence that shifted the ground. South Africa questioned the legitimacy of any foreign power positioning itself as the moral arbiter of African land, given its own unresolved history of dispossession, both at home and abroad. The words landed like a quiet explosion. Western media outlets rushed to respond, framing the statement as defiant, aggressive, dismissive. But something unexpected happened. Across the continent, the response was different. Support poured in. From Namibia, voices echoed similar experiences. From Zimbabwe, memories resurfaced. From Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, Ethiopia, different histories, same pattern. Land taken, resistance crushed, narratives controlled from elsewhere. The plan that was meant to isolate South Africa had done the opposite. It unified. Online, African journalists and creators began telling fuller stories. Long threads, documentaries, podcasts, family histories. The algorithm, usually indifferent, struggled to contain it. A counter-narrative formed, not reactive, but rooted. Washington watched this unfold with growing unease. The plan had been designed for a world where Africa reacted predictably, defensively, fragmented, apologetic. Instead, it was calm, coordinated, and confident. Markets noticed. Diplomats noticed. Then came the strategic consequences. South Africa began signaling shifts. Trade talks paused. New agreements explored. Partnerships accelerated within BRICS and beyond. Media independence funds announced. Continental platforms strengthened. None of it dramatic on its own. But together, it sent a message. Africa was no longer interested in being managed through outrage. The emotional climax arrived not in a confrontation, but in a moment of collective clarity. At an international forum, a South African delegate took the floor. The hall was full, leaders, journalists, observers. The speech was not long, but it was precise. Africa did not reject criticism, the delegate said. It rejected hypocrisy. It did not deny history. It demanded that history be told in full. It did not ask for permission to address its own land question. And then, a pause. For centuries, the delegate continued. We were told our pain was inconvenient. Today, we are told your fear is urgent. We reject both frames. Our sovereignty is not negotiable. The applause was restrained, but the impact was unmistakable. Back home, young people watched the clip on their phones. Elders nodded quietly. For the first time in a long time, the story felt familiar, not because it was old, but because it was finally being told from within. The United States never formally withdrew the plan. Bureaucracies rarely admit miscalculation, but its momentum faded. Headlines moved on. The narrative lost energy. What remained was something more enduring. A reminder that Africa was not silent because it had nothing to say, but because it had been waiting for the right moment to speak. The soil remained contested. The future remained complex. No speech solved centuries of injustice. But something had shifted in the global atmosphere. The assumption that Africa would always explain itself to be understood had cracked. And in that crack, a new voice emerged, steady, unyielding, and uninterested in applause. The story was never about farmers alone. It was about who gets to define crisis, who gets to claim moral authority, and who controls the lens through which history is viewed. In the end, the plan backfired not because it was loud, but because it underestimated memory. And memory, once awakened, does not ask for permission.